And returning to the show this morning is Professor Jeff Kripal. Dr. Kripal is Professor of Religious Studies at Rice University in Houston, Texas. He is the author of the Super Humanities, The Flip, and his latest book, How to Think Impossibly, is the topic of our discussion this morning. So Jeff, welcome back to the show. It's an honor.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
Absolutely. So How to Think Impossibly, I just want to start off, is a fantastic book. It really makes you think and not just on the nose in terms of impossibility, but lots of other things and ramifications we'll get into. However, I felt that this book was very much a continuation of your previous work, the Super Humanities. So can you give us an outline of what the Super Humanities entail?
Yeah. So I wrote this book called the Super Humanities in 2022, I guess. It came out then, which means I wrote it in 2021. And its argument is that the humanities are actually way more interesting than people imagine, and that they include both these rational states of knowledge that, we can think our way to, but they also include altered states of consciousness. Ideas just come to people, or images just come to artists, or stories just come to creative writers. And so that the Super Humanities is this whole thing. It includes both critical theory around class, race, and gender and sexuality, but it also includes the altered states that produce systems like idealism and different mind matter philosophies, or relationships between the brain and consciousness. And so How to Think Impossibly, it's essentially what my editor said to me was, okay, Jeff, so how do we do this thing? My joke was always, all these people showed up at my door on Halloween, and all these kids, and half of them were dressed up as superhumans, but nobody was dressed up as a professor of religion. And I think, his question was really, okay, well, how do we redefine the humanities then? How do we do this thing to make it stick in the world? And he's the one actually who came up with the title, How to Think Impossibly. And awesome. The category of the impossible is central to my thinking. And basically what it means is that a lot of phenomena that happen to people are impossible, but the impossibility is a function of our framework, of our worldview. It's actually not a function of the phenomena themselves. And so we're always taking things off the table, things like precognitive dreams and telepathic communications and weird entities in the bedroom, things that actually do happen to people quite commonly, but we then say things like, oh, that didn't happen, or oh, that person drank too much, or that person was on drugs, or whatever we say, we pull something out of the sky and for some reason we believe that nonsense. But we do. And to preserve this sort of banal worldview that I think we somehow feel we need to support and continue. And so what impossible thinking is essentially recognizing that all of our worldviews and thoughts are inadequate to these phenomena, and trying to listen to them. And by listening to them, I mean taking them seriously, but not necessarily literally. When someone has a precognitive dream, or an apparition, or an entity appears in the bedroom, that often is a world-changing event for that person, and it means something. But as people who are thinking about all of these experiences, it doesn't help to assign our names to a particular worldview. It doesn't help us to embrace uncritically a particular interpretation of what's going on. I think it's much healthier and much more of a conversation to just keep those things on the table and have a conversation about how to interpret them. And that's often really helpful to the experiencer as well, by the way. It's not just a geeky thing in the head. It's often a very human thing as well. So that's what the book is about, is thinking with these experiencers and trying to come to ideas and models that are much more capacious and much more true to the actual human experience rather than just a slice of it.
Thank you so much for that answer. And yeah, what really, a line that really caught me in the Super Humanities book, and I was hoping you could elaborate on this, and I think you've kind of just done that, but if you could go a little bit further, was you write that if one cannot appreciate and understand paranormal phenomena, then one cannot appreciate and understand what a human being is. So could you kind of talk about this more? I found this fascinating.
Yeah, by that phrase, I mean something fairly basic. What we call the paranormal, the word was coined in French, by the way, in 1903, and it simply meant to the side of the normal. It did not mean supernatural in the sense of some kind of divine agency. It meant something is happening that is part of this natural world, which we don't understand and we don't have a model for. So it's supernatural in the sense of the space between those two words. It's not supernatural in the sense of the single word. And what I mean by that phrase you quoted is human beings commonly have these experiences. I mean, it's just, you just scratch the surface. You just get someone talking and they'll start telling you about such an experience. And they're deeply meaningful to people. They're often the most meaningful thing as the person's lives. So that's what I mean when I say you can't really understand a human being without understanding these things. And by understanding them, I don't mean you're explaining them or you're reducing them to your worldview. I mean, you're listening, you're taking them seriously.
What you call in thinking and possibly thinking with, in terms of understanding and taking into consideration these experiences that people have. Absolutely. And you ground much of Thinking Impossibly in the work of romantic writers, such as one of my favorites, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Blake, a favorite of yours and mine, as well as philosophers like Nietzsche with the Übermensch, and Henri Corbin's concept of the imaginal. So could you discuss that further?
So which of those do you want me to discuss?
Whatever you'd like. This is kind of all over.
I mean, the story I always tell here at this point is that I hosted this conference years ago at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, and I asked everybody to come with two things: some extraordinary experience or story that happened to them, and a model of the imagination that can make that story or that experience meaningful. Everybody came with a crazy story. Nobody came with a model of the imagination. And it made me realize that as a culture, even as an academic culture, we have no way of thinking about the imagination other than as the purely imaginary, as just made up shit. And that is simply not how the imagination functions. Certainly in the history of religions or the history of esoteric or magical experience, things appear, things have their own agency. And so what I'm trying to get at with this book is, how do we theorize these apparitions or these visions or these poems or these novels or these works of fiction today that are clearly based on something that appears to someone, something that happens to someone, and it's not something that the person is making up consciously or intentionally. I love the Romantics because they had a model of the imagination as a kind of mediator of the real world. It wasn't just a producer of fantasy. It was the world mediated or spoke to the human being through images and through story. And I think that's essentially correct. And I think that's what religion is at the end of the day. It's reality communicating through story and image. Corbin, Henri Corbin was this French scholar of religion. He was an expert on Shia Islam, really a kind of Shiite mysticism in Iran. And he came up with this French category of the imaginal, which he wanted to distinguish from the imaginary. So the imaginal world was this middle world where the real spoke to the human through images and stories again, but it wasn't false or fluff or a product of fantasy. It was the real world mediating itself through the imagination, as it were. And what I do in the book is I show that actually Corbin did not coin that expression. It actually goes back to Frederick Myers in the 1880s and 1890s, and even further back into entomology, where the imaginal is the imago, or the perfect insect that the wormy caterpillar is moving towards, is maturing towards. So the imaginal discs, even today, in a worm or a larval stage, are the discs, or the sort of the buds of this future development or maturation of the insect. And this is what Myers meant by the imaginal. He was referring to things like telepathy, which he coined, and clairvoyance, and precognitive dreams again. These were like buds of our future development or evolution.
And I just want to get in here because I really loved this quote that you started the book off with. And it really has stuck with me ever since. You quote Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He writes, what if you slept, and what if in your sleep you dreamed, and what if in your dream you went to heaven, and there plucked a strange and beautiful flower, and what if when you awoke you had the flower in your hand? What then? And that really stuck with me throughout the whole book. I really think that it kind of tied into what you were trying to get at with this imaginal concept there, that we as human beings, speaking of liminal spaces, kind of occupy this line between life and death and ultimate reality. And these symbols manifest, and can't explain it. And if I could just add something else, because when I was reading your book, it really reminded me of Wouter Hanegraaff's book, Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination at times, especially this part where he talks about the solace of Crowley's and his incubation experience. Or I don't know if it wasn't an incubation experience, but he wanted to experience the god Asclepius. And Wouter writes something very interesting about how Iamblichus saw the imagination, right? He writes, again, we must beware of jumping to modern conclusions and reading this passage in terms of priestly deceptions or magical trickery. The key to luminous epiphanies, according to Iamblichus, lies in our faculty of imagination, phantasia. What happens is that the external light has an effect on the luminous vehicle of our soul, and this allows the gods, acting by their own volition, to take possession of the imaginative power in us. In other words, the human imagination was considered not as an agent of illusion, but as a faculty of perception that made it possible to see the gods. So I thought that was perhaps important to bring here. So yeah, it just, sorry, all of your work kind of got me excited.
That's it. So. That's it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the Hermetic, of course, or Neoplatonic interpretation of the Fantasia. But again, that's really, I think, feeds into what we call German and English Romanticism as well, and ultimately into how to think impossibly.
Absolutely, and you propose the ultimate ground of the book, so to speak. You propose, and it's not the only possible, shall we say, solution for this. Thinking about this, but you propose dual aspect monism as a groundwork for thinking impossibly. The human body, brain, spine organism as a liminal space through which the paranormal and fantastic breaks through the illusions of time and division, not unlike what Wouter was talking about there. So you express this in the phrase, and you bring this up quite frequently. You brought it up in the Superhumanities, and it's all over How to Think Impossibly. The world is one, the human is two. So tell us more about this.
Yeah, I mean, so I get pushed a lot on what I think. And, so I've thought a lot about that. And dual aspect monism is an abstraction. It's a bad phrase. but what it refers to is this idea that there's some kind of super reality that's above or below our perceptions, and that in a human being that the world splits out into a material dimension, into a mental dimension. And so I experience myself looking out onto this physical world, But that split, that two-ness, is simply a function of my perception and my cognitive abilities. The world really isn't like that. The world really is not separated into a mental and a material dimension. The world is one, but the human is two, as I say. And so that's what I mean by dual aspect monism. This whole book, going back to the Coleridge quote, it's really struggling with the fact, and I think it's a fact, I think it's a historical fact, that the human imagination often appears in the physical world, that physical things happen. The rose that Coleridge talked about, or the flower he talked about plucking from heaven, is actually a real thing. It really shows up in the literature where people are stunned that there's some physical component to what they're imagining. So their imaginations are not cut off from the physical world. And the example I always give here is simply a precognitive dream. A dream, of course, is a function of the imagination, and it's a mental phenomenon, but it corresponds to something that's about to happen the next day or the next week or in 3 years. And so it has this physical component to it that is precisely what makes it so uncanny or so strange. And so there's this link between the mental and the material, and I like the dual aspect monism because it explains that very, very clearly by tracing it back to a single reality.
Thank you so much for that. And Jeff, I hope you don't mind, but I really appreciate this audience member. And he has a really interesting question that I think is very pertinent to our discussion. So I don't know if you'd be okay with answering this question, but Michael,
I'll try.
I think it's actually quite pertinent to our discussion because we're going to get into almost like the human being as an interface for the imagination. And Michael E., thank you so much, asks, are there parallels between Gnostic themes and the ideologies driving Silicon Valley tech advancements, especially with AI and the pursuit of singularity?
Yeah, no, I can speak to that. So Michael, I really one of the pieces I always recommend is Nicholas Lowe's essay on this in the Harvard Divinity Bulletin from last spring. He deals with whether the tech dreams of Silicon Valley and AI are really faithful to what Nietzsche said and thought about the superhuman, and his answer is no. And my own answer to your question, Michael, would be that what Silicon Valley and AI totally lacks is a vertical dimension. It's AI and technology, it's a horizontal plane. And the idea is that if you get enough computer chips interacting with one another, they'll suddenly become conscious somehow. That consciousness is reducible to material reality. True. I think that's a terrible mistake. I think that's what drives our modern depression and our modern crises is precisely that reduction of mind or consciousness to material processes. And I think that the dreams of the singularity and the dreams of certainly AI today in Silicon Valley are based on that same materialism, and it's just false. It's not only false, it's destructive.
Thank you for that answer, Dr. Kripal. Thank you for that question, Michael. I always appreciate you.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because I'm looking at the question again, the thing about Gnostic themes, the thing about Gnosis that's so interesting is it has that vertical dimension, right? So Gnosis is this direct realization of one's own divinity that places oneself outside the physical world. The physical world is not reality, but this Gnostic direct realization is. And this is what sets it apart and makes it so distinct from what's going on today. I think they couldn't be any further apart, even though they might look similar in some superficial ways.
Whenever discussions or questions about singularity and post-humanism and transhumanism come up, I always, like you, I always think that a lot of it lacks the vertical dimension. It's always a very horizontal thing, and a really great book that I love by M. David Litwa, Post-Human Transformation in Ancient Mediterranean Thought. He really emphasizes that at the end, that a lot of this lacks the moral component, the vertical component, the ascending component, and it just kind of looks at it from perspective of getting better as opposed to ethically getting better. So,
well, this is why the superhumanism is not transhumanism. Superhumanism is precisely integrating that vertical dimension with that horizontal dimension. It's integrating this transcendence with this critical theory that is more horizontal. Transhumanism is just the horizontal. There is no transcendence, and that's again the problem, and that's why superhumanism is not transhumanism.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for that term, because I really use it for the show now. I really I've been doing the show for 2 years now. In about 5 days or so. I think I actually, this week was when I did my first interview 2 years ago, and I really came to the narratological work on narratology. Speaking of that, I talked to Sarah Iles Johnson about that a little bit in terms of myths as narratives the other day, and your work on the Super Humanities really brought home that what we're doing is what I'm trying to do here is what you're kind of saying. The Super Humanities, you're integrating this concept of we're understanding that the imaginal and the transcendent kind of breaks through the everyday reality, and that's what the humanities is: the study of religion and classics. It's the study of transcendence breaking through into that horizontal A to B frame. So thank you for that. I appreciate it for sure. But you write that the imagination is an interface. Instead of the originator, it is wired into a higher ontological truth. So could you elaborate further?
Well, all I mean by that is that the imagination does translate this vertical dimension into this horizontal dimension, and that, what we think of as image or art or story or apparition or vision is essentially a form of thinking that's coded in ways that are not linguistic or certainly not mathematical or rational. And that too is a legitimate form of thought. And so that's what I'm trying to articulate with words, and paradoxically with words. But I'm thinking with these experiencers and trying to give them, not just, I guess the last say isn't the right way to put it, but the last vision or the last imaginal experience.
My bad. Sorry, everybody. Technology is not always my friend. So what is the importance of ontological shock to the agenda of the Super Humanities and thinking impossibly?
Yeah, I mean, what I think, when I talk about thinking impossibly, I also think about thinking possibly. And whenever someone reduces a set of experiences to something familiar in their world, I think, oh, you're thinking possibly. So, I mean, just to go to this thing I love talking about UFOs for whatever reason. And when somebody says, oh, it's demons, I'm like, oh my God, that is so predictable. That is so thinking possibly. Or they say, oh, it's the military, or oh, it's fraud, or oh, it's misperception. Of course, sometimes it is. I don't want to deny that. But that reduction back to a particular worldview or a particular explanatory device is thinking possibly. And what I mean by thinking impossibly is don't do that. Don't think your thoughts. Don't believe your beliefs. Don't accept your worldview. And ontological shock is that moment where you are literally kicked out of that worldview or that set of assumptions, usually by some kind of interaction or some kind of direct experience. So I'm not proposing that readers or thinkers necessarily know ontological shock, but experiencers certainly do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kripal. And speaking of UFOs as demons, I thought this would be a nice little segue because we're going to talk about UFOs and near-death experiences in a second. But I wanted to circle back to the discussion we were having about tech and singularity for a second, because I have a very special viewer in the audience, Stephanie Shea of Rejected Religion, fantastic show. She wanted to know, I guess I missed this when we were having the discussion earlier. So how would Gnosticism influence AI and tech in this scenario with no vertical aspect? That's a very good question.
Well, just the idea that we live in a virtual reality, and that what we see is not what we get, essentially. That, there's this simulated reality that we're caught in, but behind that is nothing but neurons and hardware and organic human beings again. So there's definitely a doctrine of simulation, which is very Gnostic, but there's no transcendent salvation or escape or realization from that.
Yeah, Stephanie and I actually had a conversation about a thinker, let's just say, who believed that UFOs were demons, Sherry Schreiner, not too long ago. So that was a very fun show, Stephanie. So
Yeah, of course, there's a lot of evidence for that. I mean, but again, what do we mean by the demonic or the Luciferian? I mean, it's, there's an esoteric aspect to Lucifer, as we know, and just because a religious experience is negative or destructive doesn't mean it's not a religious experience. It just means it doesn't fit in, again, to our worldview. So impossibility and the demonic are quite aligned, actually.
And yeah, we'll get into that with the UFOs. It's a topic that we didn't get to discuss too much during your first appearance, but I know that it's one of your things, so I wanted to let you go off on UFOs.
Well, it's useful. It's useful. I like thinking about things people can think with, and I think they can think with those topics.
Absolutely. And what does the near-death experience have in common with something like UFOs? You touch upon this in the book quite a bit.
Well, yeah. If you talk to near-death experiencers, of course, they'll often relate to you some kind of verticality again, some kind of transcendence outside the body, and they'll often talk about energies and light, and they'll often encounter entities in the environment. These things will often happen on a bed, by the way. So the similarity between the near-death experience and the abduction experience often goes down to really close details about the body being flat, being on your back, leaving your body, states of energy, sometimes encountering dead loved ones, by the way, in the context of abduction experiences. So sometimes the parallel or the comparison is quite dramatic. Somebody comes back from an abduction experience and says, "Hey, I saw so-and-so was there, and it turns out that person died, the day before, and the person didn't even know that." So that's a pretty clear connection between a near-death experience and an abduction experience.
Yeah, and the UFO is very interesting because it's kind of replaced like old mythology and religious symbology in our modern culture, and it's almost become a religious thing for a lot of people. So
I think you can just remove the almost. And also, the UFO is very much connected to the world of the dead and to the ancestors, and you see this particularly in other cultures. You might not see it in American military culture or politics, but you definitely see it in a lot of American indigenous cultures and in African cultures, where there's some kind of light or ball of light or spinning disc even that's associated with the world of the ancestors. So I think different cultures pick this up and experience it in different ways. is what I'm trying to say. I don't think that the European or Euro-American experience and what we call the UFO, because of this Cold War invasion mythology that we live in because of Hollywood and the Cold War and all this stuff, it's not definitive for all of humanity. It just isn't. Human beings have been experiencing these things for millennia, and they've been wrapping other mythologies and other worldviews around them. And it's not that I want to sign my name to, ancient Greece or, medieval Christianity or whatever. That's not my point here. My point is that different human cultures not only interpret these things differently, but actually experience them differently.
It's very interesting. You even think about the way the Greeks and the Romans look, and this isn't in the agenda, Jeff, so I apologize about just bringing this on you. But, you were talking about the concept of the UFO and near-death experience, and, it is almost like a descent. And now that I'm just kind of thinking about it, one of my favorite texts of all time is Book 11 of the Odyssey, the Nicaea book, where Odysseus goes down to the underworld, and I'd love to see like a sci-fi adaptation of that, like where he's like on a spaceship or something. But I digress. But I mean, you're right. It's I think in the sense that, like, if you even think about how the Greeks and the Romans philosophically thought about the moon, you look at the Neoplatonists, just to go back to them. I mean, really, the way that they thought about the levels of the heavens and reaching the one and the daimonic intermediaries, it really is almost like a proto sci-fi kind of way of seeing the world. Like,
it's not even proto. I mean, it's sci-fi. it's legitimate science fiction, as Martin Riesbro used to say. I mean, it really is. It's like, this is it. I mean, what we call science fiction. What we call science fiction today is, again, a lot of our science fiction authors are writing out of altered states, by the way. And they're having
Philip K. Dick, who was a big,
oh my God. I mean, they're having these experiences.
And he's a good example of what you're talking about too, of the imagination as a transmitter. He his Valis trilogy, and he really is like being beamed these experiences. And he's really experiencing the world as like, there's no time, there's no, at least in terms of chronology, things like that. And it really is fascinating. Like he's writing exactly what you're talking about in terms of the brain as an interface for something.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day about Philip K. Dick, but what's so interesting about Dick is Hollywood loves Philip K. Dick, but they won't touch the Valis trilogy, right? I mean, have you seen any of the Valis trilogy turned into a movie? No.
Never. I don't think we'll ever see it.
No, because they don't want you to know, or they don't like that Philip K. Dick, who's actually religious, who actually thinks this is real, who thinks it's that there's some entity or form of super intelligence at the end of all space and time that's sort of pulling us toward it. They don't want that vertical dimension. They want to keep everything, again, on this flat horizontal plane. And so that's my complaint, Jason, is why are we doing that? I mean, why are we being so freaking boring when we have this amazing super humanity that is just showing up everywhere, and we could turn people on with it, but we just don't. We just keep saying the same boring shit over and over again. And it's depressing. It's really depressing. And it's also true. We're absolutely right to do that. It's true. But it's not adequate. There's always Valis, or there's always Gnosis. And that's not what we're not writing stories about, or we're not making movies about.
I think I even alluded to that too. I think that they're missing out on Valis, and they're missing out on the Nag Hammadi cinematic universe. I mean, if they can pour hundreds of millions of dollars into like the Craven Morbius Venom verse, then somebody could spring a couple of $1 million for a Apocryphon of John movie or a Valis movie. I mean, but I digress.
Well, just to complain a minute about the multiverse. I mean, the multiverse was invented by physicists to return us to non-meaning and nihilism and complete randomness. The problem, as they call it, I don't think it's a problem at all, I think it's a promise, is that everything looks set up. All the numbers in the cosmos are just finely tuned, as they say, to create consciousness and to create you and me. And that makes no sense whatsoever in a random, meaningless, nihilistic universe. And so they invent this many worlds thing to return everything to randomness and to me. We just happen to be in the one that works out. I'm like, oh my God, that's such a stretch. And it's again, it's a denial of our own superhumanity, I think.
It really is.
It is. And I know it's popular in Hollywood and people love the multiverse. They think it's cool. I don't think it's cool at all. I think it's stupid. And I think it returns everything to a kind of banality that is predictable but wrong.
It's lazy writing that they kind of got away with in the comics, and then they transferred it to the screen.
Well, it's also real. It's one interpretation of quantum physics. I mean, the many worlds universe is an interpretation, but it's not helpful. You can't establish it.
And I want to return to that, because these scientific concepts, they're not just created in a vacuum, but a lot of these concepts were created simultaneously with an interest in spiritualism and things like that. But we'll get to that, return to that, because that's a big part of your work. But Stephanie, since we're on UAPs, she wanted to know, sorry, Stephanie, we have a lot of people in the chat. Thank you so much for watching today. I appreciate it for sure. This is like, I just want everybody to know, this is like the John Peel of like religious studies, humanities shows. I don't never intend the show to be big. I want this to be like a really nice little nerdy college radio kind of show. So, but Stephanie asks, because Stephanie's fabulous. You should talk to her sometime, actually, Jeff. But Stephanie asks, if you have time, I have a question regarding UFOs. What does Dr. Kripal think about the recent attention that the unidentified aerial phenomena have been receiving from the U.S. government? And is he familiar with Diana Pasulka's work? Sorry, I can't.
Diana Pasulka, yeah. Yeah.
So thoughts,
first of all, Stephanie, just please call me Jeff. Just Jeff's fine. So I actually have a lot to say about the government military interest in UAPs or UFOs and Diana Pasulka's work as well. I don't know where to start. I think so. The government stuff, including all the drone stuff, which is going on right now, it's useful in the sense that it brings attention to the UAP and the UFO, and it brings media attention and government attention and military attention to the topic. So in that sense, I think it's really helpful. It's not helpful to me personally, because I think it, and by personally, I mean intellectually, because I think it operates with a kind of Cold War invasion narrative. And I think it's only a concern of certainly of the military if it's a threat. So you get what we call the threat narrative that gets thrown around a lot. And the threat narrative is powerful because fear is powerful. And it also attracts a lot of money. People and governments can invest a lot of money if something's a threat, if something's a military threat in particular. But the more you look at the UFO or the UAP phenomena, the more religious it looks and the weirder it gets. It doesn't look like a threat, by the way. If it's a threat, we would have been eaten a long time ago. We've been toast thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So I just don't buy that. I think it is a threat to a lot of our worldviews, but I don't think it's a threat to the species. Now, Diana's work, I know Diana well. I know American Cosmic and Encounters well. We've hosted a lot of conferences together. I think Diana's work is very powerful in that it links the UFO topic to religious studies and shows how they're very much related. And I think that's wonderful. I think that's actually one way to go. It's certainly the way I would go, but again, it's a function of our training, I think, and our worldview and perspective. I don't want to say that's the only way to go, but that's certainly the way I would go.
Thank you so much for that answer, Dr. Kripal. And thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie is not paying me to say this. I'm a big fan of Stephanie's work. Everybody go check out her Patreon. She does a fantastic show, fantastic work, 5 years now. Much more disciplined than I am. So
if I can say one more, I would say one more thing to Stephanie too. You know, absolutely. The thing about Diana's work and the thing about what I'm trying to say here as well is, I think in the study of religion, we are trained to bracket out any of these ontological questions. And certainly what I'm trying to say, and I think what Diana is saying too, is that comes with real costs. And that's probably a mistake. It's certainly a mistake in terms of understanding experiencers. The only thing they want to talk about is ontology. They don't care about this other crap. I mean, they're like, yeah, whatever. Like, let's talk about reality. Let's talk about how I am completely shocked by the nature of reality now, and I'm thinking about the soul and the spirit in a completely different way. That's what they want to talk about. And that's what I think that these experiences are really about. I don't think they're about social representations or discourses or power or identity or any of the other things we're trained to do, which again are all true, but simply not adequate here.
This discussion is making me simultaneously so excited, but also so down because, you know, humanities are so sexy. You know, everybody thinks that comic books and things like that are so sexy, but like we were just talking about the Neoplatonic idea of the cosmos and the cosmology and these daimonic kind of hierarchies in the sky, and how it really is science fiction, and that's kind of the point of the show. Like I grew up in Austin, so in Austin there was a phrase, a slogan in the 90s. Everybody probably remembers it who lived in Austin: keep Austin weird. And I was like, my thing now is keep Antiquity weird, because Antiquity is weird and it's sexy and it's just as strange and comic booky as anything today. So I think
it is a comic book. It is science fiction, and science fiction and comic books are not what we think either. I mean, this is the sexy part, and that's really what the Super Humanities is about, Jason. It's about making the humanities sexy again. And I mean all of the humanities. I don't just mean the study of religion, you know.
Absolutely. And I didn't put this in the agenda, but since we're talking, it kind of got everything going. You have a chapter talking about neurodivergence, autism, and, you know, thinking impossibly. And you spend a lot of time on a case study of a person you named Kevin in his kind of thought world. So I wanted to know if you could talk about this a bit, because I found this fascinating, because we're talking backstage about something personal and how people who deal with the neurodivergent emotions and things like that perceive reality. So I thought it was kind of pertinent, and I'd like to hear your thoughts more on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is Kevin. I mean, this is what I mean by thinking with people. His name, by the way, is Kevin, C-A-N-N, and he has a website called Platonic Surrealism. That's how he encapsulates his worldview. Platonic Surrealism is his name for it. Kevin taught me a lot about the history of religions, and certainly the history of unusual experiences through this neurodiverse perspective. He's a self-described autistic gentleman, and he thinks about Kundalini phenomenon. He thinks about sexuality. He thinks about UFOs. He thinks about demons. He thinks about all kinds of paranormal phenomena through his autistic condition and through his ideas around trauma and suffering and Platonic surrealism. And so in that chapter, that's chapter 3, I'm really trying to walk my talk, Jason, and say, look, I'm going to hand this over. I'm going to hand my voice over to Kevin and let him speak for himself. And this is really where my own ideas come from, by the way. It's not just Kevin, but people like Kevin. Absolutely. And Kevin was he was fantastic. He was He's still fantastic. He still shares with me essays and ideas all the time, and we wrote that chapter together. It's chapter 3 in the book. I think it's called "How They Are Not Quite Human."
It is that they are not human. Yes.
Yeah, that they are not human, and of course Kevin means that in an autistic manner, but also as relating to this alien theme or this religious theme of otherness.
And the mantis imagery comes up now that you mentioned that. Sorry, it just kind of popped up. So sorry, your work always gets me kind of going all over the place. So I apologize.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? It's wild.
Yeah, but could you talk about this mantis imagery in music and art, and especially obviously in the UFO phenomena, but it pops up quite a bit, not only in modern conceptions of art, but also in other different cultures as well. So I found this fascinating. So if you could elaborate.
Yeah. So the praying mantis, is this little, of course, this little insect that exists all through the globe, actually, and it comes up in human folklore as this trickster figure, and as somebody some spirit who oversees this other world. And of course, it comes up also in the martial arts in China. And it comes up in the modern surrealist movement in the 20th century in Europe. It also comes up a lot in abduction experiences where people see mantis beings, and these mantis beings are often large, and they're overseeing some other kind of experience. And so the one case I go into quite a bit is Stuart Davis, who's written a lot about his own experiences with this mantis being. And Stuart's a professional comedian, but also a screenwriter and songwriter. And he encountered a mantis, basically a gigantic 8-foot mantis in a purple cloak, as he calls it, that then initiated a whole set of experiences, including a lot of synchronicities with the actual insects, the little praying mantises. So I'm just trying to get into the weirdness of it, Jason, and how we think about that, and I don't want people to take that off the table. And people can say, well, that's impossible. And I'm like, yeah, but that's my point. That's exactly the point. It is impossible. And yet it happened, and so let's dwell with that. Let's think with that. Let's go there. Let's do that.
Yeah. I mean, and a great example that you use quite a bit in your previous 2 books was a book, I can't pronounce his name, but the book is called They Flew.
They Flew. Yeah. Carlos Sayer.
That's a text that comes up, it's a text that, this happened to people. People are not narrating this like this is like a legend or some kind of metaphor. Like these people, hundreds of people saw these saints levitating, and it reminds me again of the Neoplatonists, like when you read Eunapius and you have all these anecdotes about what was his name? I don't know. I don't think it was it Iamblichus? I don't think it was Iamblichus. It was Iamblichus, and how his Iamblichus's followers said that your servants say that at night that you levitate and feed off the ground and things like that. And he just kind of laughed it off, and it's the same kind of thing. Like these aren't being narrated like they're metaphors.
That's Coleridge's Rose again. Coming from heaven. What do you do when a body floats off the ground? I mean, this is no longer. I mean, we think of imagination as just an internal, subjective, kind of woo-woo state. Well, what happens when it results in a body lifting off the ground? And what Carlos Sayer does. Carlos Sayer, by the way, is a historian. He's not a scholar of religion. He's a historian of early modern Europe, and he goes through all these cases where there are not 1 or 2, but hundreds of witnesses, often in broad daylight, watching a person float or fly, into a tree or into a statue or something. And again, what do we do with that? How do we think about that? Well, you've got to rethink how you're thinking of the relationship between the mind and the material world, for sure. And what Carlos shows in the book, which I think is so powerful, is certainly what happens in the 17th and 18th century with demonology or demonological writing is it's really a Protestant Catholic fight. And the question is not whether so-and-so floated or flew. That's accepted. The question is agency. Does this come from God or does this come from the devil? And the Protestants and Catholics often landed, not always, but often landed on opposite answers or views.
So I was pleasantly surprised to see this next figure come up in your book, because as an Austin, Texas kid, I grew up there. I was born there.
Bill Hicks.
Yes, Bill Hicks. If you grew up in the 90s in Austin, Texas, you knew who Bill Hicks was, along with Daniel Johnston. Those two are kind of like the folk heroes of that place. So the late and legendary comedian Bill Hicks is brought up in a few places in this book. And like I said, he actually is still kind of like, he really informs a lot of my attitudes towards life. I have so many fond memories of like me and my friends like watching his stand up, and it just kills me that he's been kind of, I'm just going to say this off the record. I know not everybody's going to agree, but it just kills me that his thought and his approach to these things has been kind of cosplayed and subsumed by the bro manosphere culture, because Bill Hicks would have been mortified to see that that's where his thought ended up with people like Joe Rogan. But I really think that he had a lot of wonderful things to say, and he talks about a lot of things that you talk about in this book in terms of the concept of this ground of being experiencing itself, and reality and time is not necessarily a real thing. It's just how we're experiencing ourselves as this ultimate being. So let's discuss him for a bit. Tell us about Bill Hicks.
Well, there's a lot of discussion of comedy, right, in the book. And the reason, well, Bill Hicks, I didn't know about Bill Hicks, and I was writing this book, and this colleague of mine at the university says, "Well, Jeff, this sounds like Bill Hicks," and I'm like, "Okay, who's Bill Hicks?" And so I looked him up, and I watched his comedy, and what was so striking to me about Hicks's comedy was he was a stand-up comedian in the 80s and 90s, and he's kind of the comedian's comedian. He has kind of a legendary status in the comedic world. But what's so stunning about Hicks, he's a lot like Philip K. Dick. We talked earlier. He would say all these metaphysical things on stage, and people thought it was just a joke. But he wasn't joking. He was integrating the metaphysical positions about the nature of consciousness and time and space into his stand-up. I mean, he was telling jokes, obviously. He was being funny, but he was also trying to communicate a particular kind of gnosis or a particular kind of worldview. And, he had, as you know, he had a UFO experience, an abduction experience on psychedelics, actually, which is also another common comparison, by the way, between psychedelic states and abduction states that people don't like to talk about, but it's obvious. It's just obvious. And so Hicks is a really important figure for me, partly because of this weaving of his comedy into metaphysics and metaphysics into comedy, but also because he was such a central Texas, even Houstonian figure. I mean, he literally walked the campus that I walk every day, and so I feel a bonding with Hicks that I probably wouldn't feel with other, even though I didn't watch him as a kid. Jason, I did not know who Bill Hicks was. I want to be clear. I watched a lot of comedy, by the way, in the 70s and 80s, but I did not watch Bill Hicks. Or if I did, I don't remember. But yeah, I mean, again, it's this weaving. This is what I mean by the superhumanities again. It's this weaving of the superhuman into the human that is so powerful to me, and so part of this book.
Yeah, I think the epitome of what Bill Hicks tried to convey with his comedy is the section, the ride, which is in his stand-up, where he talks about how this is just a ride. That sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, but it's just a ride. And he really emphasized, and this will actually get into my last question about the ramifications of realizing that human beings are not only God, but also the devil, because he really emphasized that too in his work. He would tell all these really racy jokes, and everybody from Dennis Miller, like I said, or not Dennis Miller, but Dennis Leary to Joe Rogan, of like basically Doug Stanhope, of like rip Bill Hicks off completely wholesale. And like you said, he is the comedian's comedian. So if you know Bill's work, you'll watch somebody and be like, okay, I know what this guy's trying to do here. But I digress. Yeah, everybody check out Bill Hicks if you haven't heard of him. He's a amazing thinker, lost way too soon, died of cancer at 32, I believe, which is way too young. He reported on Waco, things like that. Like, so it was very strange. I have very fond memories of Kevin, because Kevin Booth, his dear friend Kevin Booth, used to run a lot of his stand-up on the public access here in Austin at the time. So you get to see a lot of it there too. So you would see a lot of not just Bill Hicks stand-up, but like him reporting from Waco. So he did a lot of really interesting things. So everybody go check that out. But Jeff, the final part of the book, like I said, had some very troubling but also liberating conclusions. So I found myself very troubled by the conclusions of chapter 6. The horrifying realization that we as humans are both God and the devil. So what are the repercussions and responsibilities for humans that this conclusion entails?
Yeah. So I've been saying this for 30 years, and I'm not sure it's always understood. My argument has always been that there's no necessary connection between a mystical experience and a moral behavior. That mystical experiences can result in all kinds of behaviors that may not have anything to do with them. And it's also struck me that, particularly when we look at demonic possessions, that demons and devils, they sound so human to me. And they sound like suffering humans to me. And so I think this negative aspect of the sacred or of the religious experience is as human as the positive, ecstatic, liberating aspect, but it's suffering. It's traumatized. And when I talk about the humanist too, one of the things I'm trying to say is, look, there's this social dimension, there's this social ego called Jeff or Jason or Stephanie, or whoever we want to talk about. We have to relate to one another in moral and ethical ways. But when we get to this other level, that where things are not dualistic, then a lot of those moral codes don't make a lot of sense. But it's not that we can't be or should not be moral or ethical here. And I think this is where I think I might be misunderstood. I think we should do ethics. And I think we should think heavily about the ethics of contact and abduction and religious experience and God and all kinds of things. But we shouldn't confuse those moral reasons or those ethical notions with these other states. And that then allows me to be more capacious, Jason, and I mean, not Jason, I'm sorry. It allows me to be more capacious to people's experiences, some of which are very negative and very dark and very disturbing. And I can take those in, and I can think with them as well, is what I'm trying to say. So it's not that I want us to be the devil and I want us to go in a non-moral or immoral direction. That's not it at all. It's that this should be part of the conversation too, and we should be willing to critique and criticize these experiences as much as we want to promote or embody others. and it's also seeing what I call the traumatic secret, that often it's really trauma and suffering that lie at the core, and that really trigger these kinds of experiences.
That's a great point, and it really I think there's a lot of ramifications for not just humans, but also for I think yeah. At the end of the book, at the end of the chapter, you write that the superhuman is the man, but it is also the horse. It is a
Right.
cross-species compassion. It is life itself. It is the only God. So, could you elaborate a bit on that? Because I found that
Well,
profound.
this is a legend about how Nietzsche fell into madness. That he was upset that a man was whipping his horse, and so he was embracing the horse to try to get the man to stop whipping it, and fell into his madness or his coma. But I think Nietzsche was correctly perceiving that we share life and we share consciousness with the animals, and with, in this case, the horse. And people who have pets, or frankly who have horses, they know this, and I don't know what to do with that. Again, I live in a contradiction. I want to affirm the reality, or the unity of life and consciousness. On the other hand, I eat hamburgers and steaks and chickens, and I consume animals. So what's going on there? I don't know. I think that's part of being human, is living in that contradiction. And I know there are some human communities that don't do that, of course, but I also know there are lots of communities that do that. And so this superhuman, by superhuman, I don't mean the human with testosterone and tights. I mean something beyond the human that is also uncannily human. So when you understand the consciousness of the animal or the dog or the horse, to me that's a superhuman state. And not, I'm not affirming human beings over other animals or other creatures. In fact, I'm trying to think through that process, or that idea.
Well, Jeff, I know we're at the top of we're pretty much at an hour.
Okay.
And I know this is a vast topic, and we've barely scratched the surface. So I recommend everybody pick up the book and learn how to think about these subjects and think with.
Yeah.
But if you have anything that you feel you want to emphasize that we didn't get to here, feel free to use
Well,
this time.
just the fact that I don't know. I don't know how to think impossible. I know how to think possibly, and I know when someone else is thinking possibly. I can tell you that right away. But it's not that I have answers to some of these or a lot of these questions. But that's the point. When people ask me what are the superhumanities, I'm like, this conversation is the superhumanities. That's exactly what it is. It's not a series of conclusions or convictions, or Jeff blah 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 blahing about something or other. It's about a whole bunch of people having a set of conversations about altered states and rationality and identity and race and class and science and history and literature, and you name it. It's about the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to leave this conversation, because ultimately human beings are kind of on the threshold. We are not just this materialistic ones and zeros, cold, crass, flesh and bones. We are that, but we're also on the threshold of the weird all the time. Human beings live in this space where, and much like the Greek heroes, if anybody watched our talk yesterday with Dr. Johnston, we're a liminal heroes, and human beings in general are a liminal space through which we experience life and death simultaneously. And the imagination is the conduit through which we get flashes, and that creates culture, that creates love, that creates hope. It also creates sometimes very bad things. And like Dr. Kripal said, it's a conversation that I'm really glad we have something like the Superhumanities to kind of explore these possibilities and these questions.
Well, we do so far. I mean, there's a lot of forces that are trying to eliminate, that conversation, but there are also lots of people who want to have that conversation, and that's my hope. I'm ultimately an optimist.
So, Jeff, before we go, I know you're working on a lot of stuff. You've alluded in the book several times that you have a big project you're working on. So, anything you want to plug? Where can people find you? Feel free to use this time.
I certainly have not. I mean, nothing to plug in terms of the new trilogy. I mean, it doesn't exist. I mean, it's in my head for sure. But just the website, jeffreyjkripal.com. And also impossiblearchives.org is another good place to go. We didn't talk about the archives of the impossible, but that's really what I'm doing now.
Excellent. And yes, it does come up in Dr. Kripal's work quite a bit. And the archives of the impossible, is that Rice University? Am I correct?
Yeah, that's a Rice University. It's a physical archive. And we're hosting a conference, by the way, April 3rd to the 5th of 2025. So in about 4 months. It's actually on the UFO. It's called The UFO and the Impossible.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and so please come, or please sign up online, or do whatever you do.
Excellent. Well, Jeff, thank you so much. I always love having you on.